I talked to Drew Bollmann about a month or so ago. My interview is going to get old if I don't start releasing clips from it. Let me just say, Drew was a great guy. He's a great guy. He uh, he has lots of stories. In fact, I was only going to talk to him for about an hour and get some snippets here and there. But this interview, this hour-long interview, turned into almost 2 hours of him just telling stories. And so I wanted to share with you, Icon fans, and anybody else who wants to listen, and hear about what Drew has to say about being an Icon, being a fan of Icon even before that, getting guitar lessons, and almost being a member, maybe, of a big band that we've all heard of. So here's part 1 of 3 of my interview with Drew Bollmann. Thank you for joining us here at Mighty Metal Mutt. My name is Chris, and I'm here with Drew Bollmann from Icon, or formerly from Icon. Yeah.
Oh yeah, formerly.
Drew,
All
how
right.
are you?
Good. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing good. How's the weather down in Phoenix, right? Phoenix?
It's nice. Yeah, it's 72, 73. I kind of feel like we're a little touch of Portland in the month. We have like a few rainy days a month, and then the rest of it's like California weather lately. It's been really weird and cool. I like it.
I have to admit,
Good.
I've never been to Phoenix. I've been as close to, I've been to the
Hmm.
Grand Canyon. That's
Nice.
about as
Yeah.
close as I've
I
been.
think it's about 8 hours away. Beautiful part of Arizona, of course, and historic, one of the
Yeah.
seven wonders of the world. It's
That's
pretty
one of those
cool.
things like pictures don't do it justice.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's so vast when you get there, and it just seems, bottomless. But it's just such an amazing place. It can be very spiritual, of course. People hike it. It's kind of cool. The Brady Bunch went there when we were kids.
So I guess let's start from the beginning. What brought you to playing guitar? What were some of your earlier influences?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. I think as early as 3 years or 4 years of age, I was interested in guitar. I had like a little plastic guitar, like most kids have,
Mm.
and I actually smashed that guitar. I was really frustrated one day and just smashed it. Of course, before I knew that people smash guitars, I hadn't seen Kiss or anybody like that. Um, but yeah, I just really had a love for the instrument. And I think around 5 or 6, there were probably acoustics around. I remember seeing guitars. My uncle played guitar. He had a really nice ES 330 or 335, like a really beautiful Gibson. And he broke that, and that was amazing. That was probably when I was 8 or 9. I think I saw that guitar and his amp. He had a Mesa Boogie amp. I remember that. And then I think around 10 or 11, I really got into it, like practicing hours a day, and by 12, I'd saved up enough money and bought a Hondo Electra or something like that, super cheap, Ace Frehley looking guitar. I wanted to be, like Ace Frehley and Kiss, like most of us. He was certainly an inspiration, at a younger age. And then Randy Rhoads, I think, and once Randy Rhoads came along, it just was pretty clear that people got into music for more than just money and girls and cars and notoriety. Randy was definitely just about pushing the genre of metal, but also the instrument. And he just was such a pristine and incredibly adept player. I think one of the coolest things about his style is that when you listen to shredders, a lot of shredders have a tendency to just go, it's a journey to get to the note, and how they get there, everyone's so impressed by, because they're sweep picking or doing whatever, or, hammer-ons, whatever. But Randy had this very fluid sound, and he knew where he was going well in advance of playing it. Probably even more so than Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen was a great, wonderful, history guitar histrionics kind of dude, really pushed the instrument as well. But Randy was different. He was more of an artist with what he put together, and he would put a solo together and had a lot of really good structure to it. And I just love that. But again, when he played, he wouldn't really play to get to the next note. It wasn't a means to the end. It wasn't a journey to his destination of notes. He just would play fluidly and he would think of where he's going, and it didn't matter if he was going down the neck or up the neck. He just knew what would make sense phrasing wise. And so he would always switch that up and change that up. And I was just blown away by this playing. Of course, I didn't see any of that. We didn't have YouTube. I only heard it on, on album. And then later when YouTube was around, I saw a few videos of him noodling around and practicing, and you could see exactly what that style was. I mean, he really epitomized that when he would play it. And you could tell that when he auditioned for Ozzy, that's all he was really doing. He was sitting there with a tiny little amp off to the side, warming up. And Ozzy's like, I want him. No audition. That guy's the guy. And because of that style, he just had an inimitable, amazing style. So huge influence, obviously. And then after that, Icon, probably a few years later. So I think when I was 14 or 15, that's when I first heard and saw Icon. And I know this is a really long-winded answer, but it is a lot of history that gets me to Icon. But I was in a band. I was 14 in my first band. We played, like Journey and stuff like that. Really fun covers. There was a singer here, and she had this great style, and she played keyboards and sang. And she went by Lydian, Lydia Payne, I think is her name. And but I just always think of her as Lydia. But so in this band, Lydian, she would tell me folklore about Icon. She'd say, there's this band called Icon, and Danny Wexler uses 3 distortion pedals rigged together, and I was like, 3 distortions, oh my God. I pictured like 3 MXR distortion pluses side by side. And so I just had this, enigmatic pick of some wild, crazy alien band that I knew nothing about. And certainly when I first saw them, I think it was at Palace West downtown, and they came out, and I mean, back in those days, you'd see a lot of horrible bands, like really bad bands. So there are very rare instances where people made it out of Phoenix alive, so to speak. But most of our bands, including my band after Lydian, which was called, what were we called? I totally forget, actually. It's not like theater. We called ourselves Theater. Like going to the movies. We're like, everyone wants to go see theater. It was a stupid name. We were horrible. Most bands were horrible. Every band was horrible. But you go to Palace Theater or Palace West or whatever, you go, you walk in and you're waiting and they kill the lights and everyone's like, yeah, it's this big, big moment. And Dan Wexler and John Aquilino come walking out, and they're holding their guitars up like this, and they're looking at you, and they're playing like this. They're just holding their guitars straight up, smokes bellowing everywhere, Pat Dixon on drums, playing the loudest drums you've ever heard. And it was just a spectacle. And they were just so much better than everyone else, better rehearsed, an extra layer of stack. They had like, 3 amps, 3 4x12s in their Music Man amps with Music Man heads on top. Each of them, I think, had 9 speakers or something, John and Dan, something like that. And it was just a spectacle. It was huge. It was otherworldly. And even if you'd never been to a larger concert venue, like the Coliseum or something, I was just blown away. I couldn't believe what was happening. And you're just mesmerized the whole time. And then the music was incredible. They really wrote incredible songs, like in the caliber of Def Leppard or Whitesnake from day one. They were just, the songs were so well written. Anyways, that's my long-winded answer of how I heard about the band and, my history of guitar playing and starting out guitar playing.
So you touched on Icon. You are not one of the original members of Icon. So how did you become a member of this legendary band Icon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went to all those shows. Once I knew who they were, I went back to Palace West all the time, Compton Terrace, Skateland or something, wherever they would play. They would open for Striper and Loudness and Autograph and all these bands. I think even Scorpions and Aerosmith at one point, something like that. They were on bills with very big bands. And Dan Zelisko, who owned, who worked at Evening Star at the time and now owns Danny Zelisko Presents. He's still a promoter here. Great guy, great friend, great person, great musicologist and creator of amazing opportunities for bands. He started managing Icon. I think he was, co-manager or managed Icon. And so I would see them everywhere. And one day, I think I was 16, and one day I got just a wild hair, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna call these guys. These guys are all local. I think I can find their information. We had phone books, all that garbage. And so I looked through the white pages for every member's name, and I found Max Wexler, and then it said children. And I knew that when it said children back in the day in the white pages, people were fairly rich. They had money because their children had a special different line, and you could call the children, you could call, you didn't have to speak to the parents, whatever. And so I thought, okay, I bet this is Dan Wexler's, household. So I called them and I said, I just called up the number. I said, is Danny there? And my friend was there listening because we were both laughing. We're like, they're never going to pick up. And so, but surely enough, the maid picked up, and I was like, oh my God, he's got a maid. And I said, is Dan there? And she goes, no, he's on tour. And I'm like, oh my God, he's on tour. She goes, can I leave a message? And I was like, oh, I wasn't prepared to leave a message. I didn't think it through. I didn't think they were going to pick up. So I just made something up on the fly. I said, I just want to take guitar lessons. Here's my number. Thank you so much. Bye. And I left that message. Never thought they'd call. But John Aquilino called when they got off tour. I think Dan was around 25 at the time. John was maybe 21. He was kind of like the baby of the band, and he was probably like me when I joined. He was very excited, to engage with fans. It was very cool. They were all very cool. Steve Clifford, live, I kind of glossed over it, but when he would come out and sing, the dude is like 6'2", 6'3". He's hulking. He's massive, very charismatic, cool looking dude. Every guy wanted to be him. Every girl wanted to be with him. It's one of those kind of vibes, like I guess Skid Row or something, and Sebastian Bach kind of a deal. Right. He was like a Sebastian Bach at the time. And so he was just so very good. And his voice was amazing live. So when John called me, I think a lot of those guys were kind of very much rock and roll legends already in Arizona, but I think John was very much more down to earth and kind of business-like. He was very cool. He's like, I'll give you guitar lessons, $40 an hour. And I was like, score, and even though that was a lot of money back then, I was like, I don't care. I'll do a bunch of chores, whatever I have to do, mow a bunch of lawns. And that's what I did. I took lessons, I think starting at 16, probably for until I was 17. So maybe for about a year or something. And we didn't really play much guitar. I asked him about what it's like to be in the biggest band in Arizona, just what it's like to have all these girls all over you, girls, cars, and music, I think were the subject matter that we talked about, which is really ironic since earlier I mentioned, Randy Rhoads was anything but about all those things. But I was just so enamored with the whole idea of them being rock stars. I just wanted to learn, as much as I could and soak it in. I was so blown away by the concept of it. And so, but John was really cool. And I remember he said something like, oh, you have really good vibrato, or something like that. Because I really enjoyed, trying to play pretty well as much as I could. And he taught me a lot of single, we started to play guitar a little bit here and there. He taught me a lot of single string techniques, or 3 notes to a string, where it's like 1 3 5 1 3 5 2 3 5 2 3 5 3 5 6 3 5 6, something like that. Like a major scale on using every string and just 3 to a string. And he would do a lot of scales like that. He would just kind of go, he would walk up the neck like that. And it would just get quicker and quicker and quicker. And it was really cool to dive into guitar like that and think of it very differently. Their chord structures were amazing. They'd play 9th chords, 11th chords, 13th chords, but in rock, and one of them would play that chord. The other would play like an E sus or something, like just very, very unique chords, and the antithesis of a lot of the style at that time, because a lot of bands were like, playing Born to Be Wild, like bar chords, every band member playing the same thing. And anyway, long story longer, that's how I got in the band. Was I took lessons from John for a while. I moved to LA to pursue, to go to music college. I went to MIT, Musicians Institute of Technology. Didn't like the rock and roll program, kind of eschewed that, went to the jazz program of MIT and learned jazz theory. And someone else had the same experience that I did 2 years prior, which was Jeff Buckley. So Jeff Buckley went there 2 years before I did, and he had the same experience. He did not like the school of rock kind of vibe to the school, and he switched over to jazz theory as well. So when I first heard Jeff Buckley, I'm listening to all these jazz stylings, and I'm thinking to myself, I do that. We all did that in class. It was nothing novel. In fact, not only was it nothing novel, but he took one of our instructors, the intro to Grace. That intro was something that an instructor named Dan Gilbert, no relation to Paul Gilbert, played for us. And, he would kind of hammer those lessons in our mind. And we would work with those as devices to get better, and more articulate on guitar and work on our dexterity. Anyway, so when Jeff Buckley came out with the album, I'm like, oh my God, these are a lot of the, Guitar Musicians Institute isms that we would learn. But the dude had has an amazing voice. Jeff Buckley, one of the best singers ever, pushing that genre, influencing Radiohead and a lot of people to sing falsetto, of course, Coldplay from there. But Jeff Buckley sang beautiful falsetto and was a really adept guitar player. So I'm in LA at this, Guitar Playing Institute, not really interested in staying in LA. I'm not an LA person. Some friends knew Guns N' Roses and Motley Crue and all these really super cool hipster bands, and they introduced me to some of those guys. I just wasn't an LA guy. And so I eventually moved back. When I moved back to Arizona, John told me this story recently where Danny Zelisko and, Eddie Trunk from Megaforce Records at the time, a subsidiary of Atlantic, Eddie Trunk and Dan Zelisko were kind of co-managing and resurrecting this band after Steve Clifford left. And they found Jerry and all that. And they said, let's do the Twin Axe Attack again. We did this album, A More Perfect Union, with Kevin Stoller, but let's get the Twin Axe Attack back again. So the way John told it to me is that they came to him and they said, we'd like you to audition for the band. And John basically passed him the 2 CDs of Icon and said, there are my audition tapes. I'm a founding member of the band, one of the first, people in the band, after, the guys in, forgetting all the guys' names, but there were a couple other guys. But yeah, John was one of the first guitar players, and he created such an inimitable style and such a very core part of their sound. He just passed those CDs along and said, there's my audition tape. They weren't for it. They were saying, no, you really need to audition. Like they're, Megaforce and Atlantic are very serious about this. So he's like, all right, I'll tell you what. Here's a guy's name, Drew Bollmann. He's great. You'll like him. Here you go. And so he just gave them my name.
Wow.
It was fluke, like total random situation. And I remember at the time that the gig for Ozzy, the bass player for Metallica, and then, this measly little tiny guitar player for an Arizona band, those were just the 3 biggest gigs I remember people going for. I remember thinking, everybody is going to want this gig. I have no shot. When I got the call, they said, we'd like you to come down on audition. I'm like, I have no chance. But I knew those songs in and out by that point. I grew my hair down to my ass, like Jakey Lee and Ozzy Osbourne. I was like, what the heck? Let's just grow it really, really long. And so I had hair down to my ass. I was 19. I was hungry. I knew all the songs. I sang. I played keyboards as well. I think I was kind of a shoo-in only because they had a few people auditioning. So I learned later that I think it was just down to a handful of people. I think one of the guys flew in from Japan also. And I think it was like 32, 33, and a guy that was older is probably pretty good too. I was okay. I was pretty good, but I'd really been playing guitar a long time. I think I was good enough, but I wasn't quite to John and Dan level at that point. I was only 19. But I think they liked me. I think they liked the fact that I was from Arizona, hungry, knew the band, knew all the songs, huge fan. And they were really cool. Yeah, especially Eddie Trunk and Dan Zelisko. And all the rest of the band members. So cool, made me feel at ease. It was a really fun audition, although I was scared to death. Anyway, so that's another long-winded story about how I got.
So do you think John passed because he was just offended by asking him to audition for his own band, or?
I think it's some of that. Probably missed Clifford, I think he might have even he probably had enough of just dealing with, the road and a lot of difficulties of being in a band. because when Steve left the band, most of us in Arizona were, it was like, I mean, most of it was a little bit of a Seattle scene that, we didn't know about Seattle or anything, but we didn't have the internet. It was very insular. Lots of bands would hope that we would be found by an A&R guy or gal, that they'd come into town and find us if Icon was signed, for example. So we were hoping that Icon would get signed. They were already signed to Capitol. We thought that Night of the Crime was just going to put us in the upper echelon of places, of vibes and scenes. And so I think a lot of us in bands were very excited about this album. We thought, okay, this is the one that's going to take us into the stratosphere. This juggernaut of an album is going to drag the rest of us with it. We'll have A&R people all over Arizona, and a whole bunch of bands are going to get signed. Gentlemen After Dark was a great band. There were some bands that were pretty good here. Surgical Steel was pretty well known. They're kind of like a Judas Priest style band. And of course, Flotsam and Jetsam were doing really well. But, and again, this is before I joined the band, before I moved to LA, all of it. I was 16 when that happened. But then Steve Clifford, his girlfriend at the time gave him an ultimatum. She said, choose the band or me right now. And he chose her. And I would say he chose wisely. I think overall, we've all made different choices. It's hard to say. I mean, maybe the wiser choice would have been, okay, I'll go, teetotaling, straight edge. I won't drink, I won't do drugs, whatever. But I will still be committed to you, and I'll still be committed to the band. I'll clean up. Many people have done it. Aerosmith rebuilt their career doing that kind of a thing, then fell back on or off the wagon. And anyway, so that's what happened. That was a huge moment for most of us, because it was like getting the wind knocked out of you. We just thought that was our one chance, and our one chance is dead. It was like the day the music died in Phoenix, Arizona. It just was really sad. Clifford left. He put an ad in the New Times paper that said famously, Icon singer selling all his gear, really good gear, something like that. Give Steve a call. Like it. I remember seeing that ad in a couple of different places and just being non-functional. We just couldn't believe any of it. So I think that it was a very big, it was a very big blow. So I think that there was some of that also when John was trying to make a decision, to whether to join or not, and to audition again. I think he was pissed that they asked him to audition. I would have been too. He was a founding member.
So you joined the band during the Right Between the Eyes album, but from what you told me, you joined after the album was done, or what was the what is your I guess your experience with the album production, and when did you join?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I was there probably a little bit more for what was happening and closer to the scenes. I think maybe even during Night of the Crime. I think if I remember correctly, John invited me down to the studio a couple of times. I think some of the other students that he had, his guitar students, went as well. And I remember being blown away. It was Chaton Studios that they were recording in. And I think they were doing some rough mixes before it actually got mixed by Capitol, something like that. Or they were just using the Chaton Studios and Steve, the owner of Chaton Studios, to play these mixes for us on, because back then not everyone had really nice sound systems and things like that. I just remember the music being otherworldly. They were kind of pulling up guitar parts, pulling it back, and it was just an amazing mix, so that I remember more so than Right Between the Eyes. When I joined for Right Between the Eyes tour, they were putting finishing touches on the album, and I think they hadn't mastered it yet. I think they were even still recording it, but it was really mostly Dan's work. He really put his heart and soul into that album and the songwriting and all that. So it was all complete and, done and dusted by the time I joined, which I was fine with. I was perfectly happy to just join for touring, because it was like joining one of the best bands in the world for me. I mean, it was like joining Kiss, so I was happy to do whatever. And I met the guys in earnest then as an actual member, and Pat Dixon was there, Tracy was there on bass, Dan Wexler, and Jerry, of course, was new, and I was new. So it was, 3/5 of the original band. And anyway, that was the vibe, is they had already, put the album together. It was it was ready for distribution and I think final mastering and distribution. And then we were going on tour. So I really joined mostly to go with them on tour. Very kind of them to put my image on the album. And I think, they wanted to convey that twin axe attack, of course. Having my hair down to my ass was probably a fun thing for people taking the photos. It's very rock and roll looking, whatever. It's pretty fun. It was cool. We did some photo shoots for the inner sleeve of the album, like some ex-girlfriends photos and stuff like that. And it was fun to put all that together and think about life. And it was a cool time. It's really interesting. And then, of course, shortly thereafter, I was driving home and, before cell phones and all that. And on the radio, I heard, coming soon to Arizona Memorial Coliseum, Bon Jovi, Ovi. And I was like, oh God, those guys are coming back. They're playing here all the time. And then it said opening up is Skid Row. Oh. And I was like, I will go see that show. I like Skid Row. I will definitely go see that show. And then it said opening up is Arizona's own Icon. And I was like, what the hell did I just hear? I pulled over the side of the road, grabbed a quarter, called on a, old school payphone. And I called Jerry and I said, what did I just hear? And he goes, we got the opening slot for Bon Jovi at Veterans Memorial Coliseum. I was like, oh my God. It was like, I had kind of a personal goal of mine. I was like really hoping I could play the Coliseum by the time I was 25 for whatever reason. And so it was really wild because here I was at 19 years old, like playing things blown away. So that was certainly one of the cooler nights. We had probably 27,000 people there. I remember it being mostly general admission, like even the seats, I think you could kind of sit wherever. So I told my dad and my family members coming for the show, you got to get there early. And I don't think they did. They got there pretty late and they had to sit way in the back, which I thought was really funny. And then the
general admission, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's 14, 16-year-old girls going to Bon Jovi. They're going there early, standing right up front. They took the whole arena. And it was really fun because Bon Jovi had these ego ramps and I had just plugged into a wireless and it was working pretty well. I just bought one of the nice wirelesses that Danny recommended. Danny was having problems with his wireless. It was combating with Skid Row or Bon Jovi. There was so much metal all over their stage, but my wireless was working. And so I just left it and I didn't think about it. So Danny wound up plugging in, Dan Wexler, he wound up plugging in, to a 1/4-inch jack. And so he was cabled to his amp and we didn't get a sound check. And of course we were stacked, it was Bon Jovi's slanted stage and then Skid Row in front of them. And then our tiny little set, squeezed it.
Yeah.
We didn't have much stage room at all. And so since we didn't have a lot of stage room and there was this, what they call an ego ramp, you could just run into the crowd, of course. I was wireless. So I just ran to the ego ramp and I didn't really have many vocals. So I just stayed out there playing guitar. And it's so weird because as you're running away from the stage, you hear this cacophony of loud sounds. In fact, when I walked out there without a sound check, I just hit my guitar like an E note or, E chord. And then I just turned up the volume like that. And it just went. And so it was just this hulking, loud sound in the auditorium. And I was just blown away. So as you run away from it, you hear it all the way back there. You hear the sound. And I was hanging out on this little tiny, ego stage, whatever they call them, just a stupid little stage. And, but I was just surrounded by people. And I remember, I mean, I was surrounded mostly by girls. I remember some of the girls were like, I love you. I was like, you don't even know me. Like, it was funny because we were shouting back and forth at one another. It was just goofy and fun. It was pure, just fun. It was really neat. And I saw one of the first girls I ever dated that believed in me enough to date me. She was really tall. She was actually, I think she was almost 6 foot. But I remember seeing her just standing there looking at me. She was, head and shoulders above the rest of the people there. And I just looked at her and I just smiled. It was just this really fun, warm moment. Also, my first girlfriend ever brought me to the show because I didn't have a car at the time because we just came off tour. And so even that was cool. Like, it was just, I saw all my friends, I saw previous girlfriends. It was just an amazing night. It was super cool. But anyway, there's a little walk down memory lane of probably, one of our best shows. Then we opened for Ted Nugent at Oktoberfest and we played, I think, almost for 30,000 people. So that was actually the biggest show I played with them. And then we opened for the Black Crowes and Michael Schenker Group as the band was breaking up, and that was a much smaller show. But those were probably the three biggest shows we played when I was with them. Other than that, we mostly played 300 seaters. It wasn't very huge.
So you had mentioned that you might know some stories involving the production of the album, Right Between the Eyes. Do you have anything that you can add to Alice Cooper? How did they get Alice Cooper, and what did they do to get Alice Cooper?
Yeah, Holy Man's War and all that. I think he was on 3 or 4 songs. Co-wrote some of them as well. So Alice, knowing all the Valley's musicians, goes pretty far back. He's arguably, I think, our most famous musician who's lived here longest. Obviously, Rob Halford lives here. George Lynch from Dokken. We have a lot of pretty cool metal stars and music stars that live here. But and even I think Glenn Campbell, lived here before probably all of them that I just mentioned. But Alice was pretty far back in rock and roll royalty, and I think he golfed with like some of the guys in Icon or something. I mean, he knew them from just being in the scene. And so he was a good friend of the band. Another guy named Randy Baker was kind of, involved with the band as well. And I know they did some sessions with him. I think I even played on those sessions later with him. But mostly for Alice, he and Danny Wexler had a pretty good symbiotic relationship. And I think Danny helped produce co-wrote some songs for Alice. Alice did the same for Danny. So there was just that kind of friendship there. And he's a really nice guy. I've met him, I think, maybe twice, and really just as an acquaintance. Great guy, and just really cool for the music scene in Arizona. Still does his figgy pudding Alice Cooper Christmas dinner with lots of stars, and like Slash comes out and plays music with him and stuff. It's a kind of a who's who of the West Coast music scene. It's really fun. Anyway, he heads things up like that, and
that's cool.
Had his club for a while too. So
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you mentioned George Lynch. George Lynch is sort of like my Randy Rhoads. Except the difference between me and you is you learn to play the guitar pretty good. I know a few chords. So
yeah, it's never too late. It's never too late. Yeah, and now YouTube also. Now we have YouTube, so we have like George Lynch showing us his solo. So he and Warren DeMartini had inimitable styles, and I actually loved both of them. I mean, I was obsessed with Randy Rhoads, but after he passed away, for living guitarists, I would say George Lynch, Warren DeMartini were certainly great influences, and I loved their music. And I mean, great ballads, great rock and roll songs. And of course, Jakey Lee was in Rat. I think Martini might have replaced him or something. And I think he even left Rat to join Ozzy, or he left Rough Cut, or forget what band he was in to join Ozzy before Jakey Lee left. But when Jakey Lee joined Ozzy, he was another huge influence, and great player, amazing player. Very different player, of course, than when he's in his different bands now. Now he's just more of a blues player, right? Like he doesn't.
Yeah.
Back then, I think he was competing with the Ghost of Randy and really trying to craft inimitable, amazing solos, fully succeeding, like just so good. But anyways, yeah, those players are. I do like George Lynch, Martini, Warren DeMartini, and Jakey Lee too.
Yeah, they're all kind of. I don't want to say interchangeable, but they always seem to be in similar. Like I know George Lynch tried for Ozzy Osbourne when Jakey Lee got it. And
right,
his good friends Warren DeMartini and all that. So it's kind of neat to see how the metal world is kind of a small world, tight knit world where you all know each other and all that.
It is, yeah. On tour, I met somebody that knew Def Leppard, and I haven't told a lot of people the story, and I don't even know if I'm allowed to tell the story, but who cares? It's so long ago. Mostly because it's almost shocking that they would even be interested in me at all. But a friend of mine knew the tour manager for Def Leppard, and I remember telling her, well, if any of the guitarists ever gets hit by a bus, you know who to call. And sadly, Steve Clark passed away, like I think 6 months later or something after I said that. I was just, sad because, I mean, one of my favorite bands lost, a great integral part of a pillar of the band. And I was like, how are they going to replace, Steve on guitar? And, how do you replace Steve Clark? So anyway, waited a couple months. I can't just run to my friend and say,
just call
it happened. I was flipping out that I might even have a shot at this band. Of course, it was after Icon. I put a package together. So I called her and I said, are they auditioning anybody? Are they continuing as a band? Obviously, Rick Allen had lost an arm and they were still continuing. I mean, this is a band that just kept going on no matter what, and such a seminal band. I mean, amazing songs. Anyway, so I asked her, I said, are they auditioning people? Would I even have a shot? And she said, I don't know. She said, put a package together, a press kit. So I went out, took photos, got a professional press kit made, learned a few songs that I didn't know off the newer album. I think it was Hysteria at the time. And I put a tape together of my playing, a little cassette tape like back in the day. And I did some solos, I did some songs, and I really put my heart and soul into this, and I was probably not even a consideration. But I did send the package off to her. She sent the package off to the band. I let it lie. I didn't ask about it. And then I kind of let a little bit of time go by, went by. And then I approached her and I said, did they ever get back to you on my, my package that I sent them or anything? And again, I don't know if this is really what happened or not, but she was kind enough to say whether, any of this happened or was told to her. I don't know. But the story that was told to her was that, Joe Elliott, the singer from Def Leppard, heard my tape. But he did say, he said, Phil Collen gets a lot of attention. He's in his 40s now. I don't think he's going to want some young 20-something-year-old joining the band, And then they said something along the lines of, we thought your playing was really good or something like that. We don't think Phil will go for it, but, we appreciate your submission, something like that. Who knows if any of that was true, if it was just a story that her contact told her, or even if Joe Elliott listened to it, or even if he ever saw my image, who knows, or if they just laughed at me. But it was pretty cool too. It was fun to, to shoot my shot and to go for one of the best bands in the world. And I was practiced up. So I was an okay player by that time because we played a lot of, on the road and stuff like that. I'd been playing for years with Icon. So it was, I felt pretty good about the tape. But when Vivian Campbell got the gig, that was pretty cool because that made sense. He's coming from Dio. He's a known player. He comes with his brand. And, that's just kind of what you want in a situation like that. Zakk Wylde, I think, was the exception to the rule. And of course, Randy himself too. But, that's when they have, of course, a relative unknown come into such a large position in music. But Vivian Campbell made perfect sense when he joined the band. It was kind of fun to watch that.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting pairing to have him with the band, but it looks like it worked out well for him. So
exactly, yeah. Your comment about the fact that it's so insular, these little scenes of metal, it is kind of a small world. It's a lot of guitarists kind of moving around and stuff. It's fun, especially when you think of Whitesnake's guitarist. Like Vandenberg was in there and Steve Vai. I mean, it's kind of wild to think about. John Sykes himself being a seminal player, amazing player. He was another influential player when I moved to LA. Like I couldn't get enough of John Sykes. So good. And Whitesnake 1987 record and all that.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed part 1 of my 3-part series with Drew Bollmann. Stay tuned for part 2.